On a fateful morning at Bayview Court in 2025, the pain and frustration of 60 years spent in a home stolen from her erupted. Yet, what shocked the world was the sudden revelation of a Navy SEAL stepping into the spotlight. Sarah Johnson stood in front of her Aunt Emily Carter's weathered wooden house, clutching the eviction notice in her hand. Her fingers tightened around it, crumpling the paper, but she didn't care. The black ink on the white paper stared back at her like a cold verdict, a harsh truth she wasn't ready to accept. Aunt Emily, who had lived here for 60 years, who had stood on this porch every morning with a gentle smile and her favorite peppermint tea, was now being forced to leave. No more ownership. No more beloved home. No place to return to. Sarah looked up at the house, the dark wooden planks, the round white-framed windows dusted with a fine layer of dirt, the steps that had started to crack and crumble with time. This wasn't just a house. It was a lifetime of memories, a place where she had grown up, where childhood stories had been written under the warm glow of the living room lamp. Now, all of it could vanish, replaced by the soulless, gleaming developments of greedy capitalists. Anger rose within Sarah's chest, but with it came a sense of helplessness. She had heard too many stories like this. Elderly people losing their homes through contracts filled with hidden clauses, scams people only recognized when it was too late. But she never imagined that today, this tragedy would strike her own family. She bit her lip, her eyes glued to the letter as though by staring at it longer, she might find a way to reverse the situation. An indifferent signature at the bottom of the page represented Redwood Realty, a name she had never heard before. She took a deep breath, trying to control the rage that coursed through her veins. Who was behind this? Who had turned a kind, elderly woman like her aunt into a victim of a dirty financial game? Sarah wasn't a lawyer, wasn't someone with power, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let this go. Behind the door, Aunt Emily still didn't know. She was probably busy in the kitchen, making her famous apple pie just as she always did when Sarah came by. Sarah couldn't bear to imagine her aunt sitting down in her favorite rocking chair, opening this letter, reading those cold, emotionless words. No, she couldn't let that happen. Her fists clenched, her fingers numb from the fury. She knew she couldn't accept this fate. A voice in her head rang louder and clearer than ever. If they think they can steal her memories, they are wrong. She shoved the letter into her bag and turned, walking straight toward downtown. She had much to do, many people to meet, and before it was too late, she would uncover the truth. Sarah walked quickly along the cobblestone sidewalk of downtown, her heart filled with unwavering determination. The eviction notice was still tucked in her coat pocket, but it was no longer a sentence. It was evidence, the spark for a battle she knew she couldn't lose. She couldn't let Aunt Emily, a woman who had spent her entire life building this home, be cast out like a mere statistic in the cold financial records of heartless capitalists. She needed to know who was behind this. She needed a name. Hours passed as she sat in a small corner cafe, flipping through documents, researching everything she could find about Redwood Realty. Finally, she stumbled upon a crucial lead. This wasn't just any real estate company. It was a front, a disguise for shady dealings hidden behind closed doors. And the one pulling the strings, Victor Grayson. The name froze her for a moment. He wasn't a stranger. Victor Grayson was a notorious real estate mogul in Bayview, a man who had built his empire by seizing properties from those without the legal knowledge to fight back. There had been a few articles mentioning him, but all were vague, none daring to dig deeper. He had power, he had money, and most importantly, he had the ability to silence anyone who dared speak out. Sarah's anger surged as she delved deeper into the old lawsuits. This wasn't just her family's issue. Dozens of other elderly people had fallen into the same trap. They all shared one thing in common. They had been duped into signing complex contracts, documents filled with hidden clauses that led them to lose their homes with no way to fight back. Aunt Emily was just one of them. Another victim was Harold Parker, a war veteran who lost his apartment in a single night. Then there was Martha Ellis, an elderly woman who had run a family-owned bakery for over 30 years, now living in temporary housing because she couldn't afford a new place. He had driven them to ruin, turning them into mere numbers in his massive profit sheet. Sarah felt the blood boil in her veins. This wasn't a coincidence. This was an organized conspiracy, and Victor Grayson was the puppet master behind it all. She stared at the laptop screen, feeling like she had just entered a real battle. He was used to no one daring to confront him, but this time he had made a mistake. He had crossed her family. Taking a deep breath, Sarah closed her laptop and stood up. She didn't know what she would face next, but one thing was certain. Victor Grayson would pay. Sarah walked out of the cafe, her mind in turmoil. Her steps carried her almost without thinking toward the hospital where Aunt Emily was being treated. What she had just uncovered about Victor Grayson had not only enraged her, but also pushed her into a sense of helplessness she had never felt before. He hadn't just deceived her aunt, but dozens of others, shamelessly stealing their homes. She knew she couldn't let this continue, but what could she do? Confronting someone with as much money and power as Grayson wasn't going to be easy. The door to the hospital room swung open, and the strong scent of antiseptic filled Sarah's nose. Aunt Emily lay there, looking smaller and frilier than ever. She turned her head to look at Sarah, offering a tired smile, yet her eyes were still as gentle as they had always been. "Sarah, you're here," she whispered, her voice soft like a breeze. Sarah nodded, forcing a smile, but her heart tightened as she saw the deeper lines on her aunt's face, the thin hands resting lightly on the white blanket. Sarah pulled the eviction notice from her coat pocket, her hands trembling as she placed it on the bedside table. "Aunt Emily." She stopped, trying to suppress the emotions, but it was impossible. "I'm sorry. I didn't see this sooner. I had no idea it was this bad." Aunt Emily slowly reached out, her fingers brushing over the cold, impersonal words. "I just wanted to hold on to the place where I was once happy," she whispered, more to herself than to Sarah. Her voice was filled with nostalgia, memories of the home that had witnessed generations grow up, moments of warmth shared by family. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, her entire body trembling with fury. She couldn't take this anymore. He had hurt her aunt. He had taken everything from her, and now he would pay. She slammed her fist down onto the table, making the glass of water on it shake. "I'm suing him," she declared, her voice sharp and resolute, stronger than it had ever been. "I'll find a way to bring him to justice, no matter what it costs. I won't let him win." Aunt Emily looked at her, her tired eyes sparkling with a glimmer of pride. "Sarah." She called her name, as if she wanted to say something, but instead, she gently squeezed Sarah's hand, as if that alone could convey everything she couldn't say. Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. She couldn't just rely on her anger. She needed a plan. She needed evidence. And most importantly, she needed a strong ally to take on someone like Victor Grayson. She stood up, her eyes blazing with determination. This battle had only just begun. Sarah couldn't sleep. Aunt Emily had fallen into a deep sleep at the hospital, but in Sarah's mind, the words on the eviction notice kept dancing relentlessly. She sat at her small apartment's desk, the soft yellow light casting shadows on her tense face. Victor Grayson wasn't just a real estate scammer. He was something far worse, a demon in human form. She opened her laptop and skimmed through dozens of old articles, digging for anything she could find about his shady deals. Redwood Realty was just one of the countless subsidiaries hidden within a complex financial web. Grayson had built an intricate network of businesses, some with names that sounded legitimate. But as Sarah looked closer, she noticed something was terribly wrong. Sarah began to trace the flow of money. The numbers on the paperwork seemed normal at first, but when she connected them, a pattern started to emerge. Millions of dollars were being funneled through offshore shell companies, with funds withdrawn from bank accounts in tax havens like the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. The deeper she dug, the more tangled and sinister everything became. Things turned strange when she discovered a company called Titan Holdings, a corporation with no website, no office, yet receiving massive payments from Grayson's network. She continued searching, finally uncovering a critical lead. Titan Holdings had ties to a shadowy organization suspected of funding illicit activities abroad. Sarah shuddered. She had thought she was merely up against a greedy tycoon, but now she realized she was facing a much larger conspiracy. Dirty money from real estate wasn't just turning into profit, it was flowing into criminal organizations, groups even the government couldn't touch. She suddenly stood up, pushing her chair back with such force that it skidded across the wooden floor. "He's not just a scammer," she yelled, her voice filled with rage. "He's a monster." In that moment, Sarah realized something. She was no longer just seeking justice for her aunt. She was touching a deadly secret. If what she had uncovered was true, Grayson wasn't just a real estate fraudster. He could be a link in a far more dangerous underground organization than she had ever imagined. Her heart raced, adrenaline surging through her body. She didn't know what she had stumbled upon, but one thing was certain. She couldn't stop now, even if it meant facing forces she had never imagined. Sarah stepped out of her apartment before dawn, her mind still reeling from the discovery she had made the night before. The dry numbers on the screen had painted a chilling picture of Victor Grayson. She had spent hours tracing his money trail, digging into shell companies and suspicious transactions. What she had uncovered not only enraged her, but also stirred a sense of fear that she couldn't shake off. Grayson wasn't just a real estate scammer. He was likely a key player in an international criminal financial network that she had unknowingly exposed. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't let this continue. Her anger flared up stronger than ever. She couldn't let him keep harming innocent people, and she couldn't let him continue to operate freely in his world where everything could be bought with money. Now, standing in front of Bayview District Court, the lawsuit tightly gripped in her hand, her fingers turned pale from the force. This was the first step in her journey toward justice. She wouldn't let Grayson walk away free. Aunt Emily had trusted the legal system, and Sarah did too. But the moment she stepped into the courtroom, she realized this battle was going to be much harder than she had imagined. Michael Holt, Victor Grayson's lawyer, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, exuded an air of superiority. He showed no sign of concern for Sarah's accusations. He merely smirked dismissively when she laid the documents on the table in front of the judge, as if she were an amateur disturbing his peaceful life. When it was his turn to speak, his voice oozed with mockery. "Miss Johnson, I'm afraid you don't really understand the law," he said, looking at her as if she were a rookie trying to play a game she couldn't win. "The contract was signed. The papers are legal. Your aunt agreed, and by law, ownership has transferred. We have no obligation to entertain any complaints from you." Sarah could feel her hands tighten into fists, her nails digging into her skin. They were belittling her. They thought she was just a small fish lost in a big ocean with no chance of winning. She glanced over at Victor Grayson, who sat confidently at the defendant's table, not even bothering to look at her, still with a smug air of someone who believed they would always win. Taking a deep breath, Sarah forced her voice to remain calm but firm. "This contract contains vague terms, coercive clauses, and is entirely unfair to people like my aunt. This was not a transparent transaction. It was fraud." Michael Holt shrugged as if her words didn't matter. If your aunt felt disadvantaged, she should have consulted a lawyer before signing. Sarah felt a fire of fury ignite in her chest. They were trying to make it seem like this was her aunt's fault, an elderly woman who had trusted the legal system to protect her. Their audacity was beyond anything she had imagined. She gritted her teeth. No, she wouldn't let them get away with this so easily. If the law had gaps that people like Grayson could exploit, then she would find a way to turn the tables. She stared at Michael Holt, then shifted her gaze to Victor Grayson, who still hadn't spoken a single word. "Go ahead and laugh," she silently told herself, "but you've made a mistake thinking I'll give up." That day's hearing ended with no favorable outcome for Sarah. The judge ruled that more evidence was needed before a full trial could proceed. Sarah walked out of the courthouse, feeling her heart race faster than ever. It wasn't despair. She knew she had to approach this differently. As she stepped outside, the cold rushed into her lungs, helping her stay focused. The legal system could be a powerful weapon, but now she understood that she needed more than that. She needed to find Grayson's weakness, something that even the law couldn't protect him from. She stopped, took out her phone, and scrolled through her contacts. Her finger hovered over a name, someone who could help her break through the legal walls Grayson had built. She pressed the call button. "We need to meet. I have something important." On the other end, a deep voice replied, "I've been waiting for this call. I'll see you tonight." Sarah hung up, her gaze sharpening like never before. If the law couldn't reach Grayson, she would find another way, and this time, she wouldn't give him an escape. Sarah walked out of the courthouse, her breath still heavy, her grip on her phone tight, as if it were the last anchor keeping her from being swept away in a storm of rage. Victor Grayson and his lawyer had thought she would give up. They had mocked her, pushed her into a legal wall as though she were some naive fool who didn't understand the rules of the game. But they didn't know that she had never been one to accept defeat easily. As she drove home, she tried to suppress the chaotic thoughts swirling in her mind. Somehow, Grayson had built a system that shielded him from justice, but he couldn't shield himself from the truth, and she would be the one to expose that truth. A ding from her phone startled her. An anonymous email had appeared in her inbox. From Anonymous. Subject: About Victor Grayson. Message: I know the truth about Grayson. If you really want to take him down, meet me tonight at Pier 7, 11 p.m. Come alone. Sarah frowned, quickly scanning the message. Someone was watching her. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. This could be a trap. She knew Grayson wasn't a simple man. If someone connected to him was trying to reach her, then she had inadvertently stepped into a game far more dangerous than she could have imagined. But what if this was an opportunity to expose him? What if this was a real lead? She couldn't ignore it. She slammed her foot on the gas, driving faster toward her apartment. If she was going, she wasn't going unprepared. 3 hours later, Pier 7. Sarah stopped her car outside the dock area, turned off the engine, and surveyed her surroundings. The area was eerily quiet. There were no workers unloading cargo, no sounds of the ships, just the sound of the waves and the street lights casting long shadows over the old shipping containers. She opened the trunk of her car, pulling out a small folding knife hidden in her jacket pocket, not because she thought it would protect her against a real threat, but because it made her feel more in control of the situation. Step by step, she moved carefully, feeling each breath as it cut through the chilly night air. She had read too many stories where the protagonist vanished after mysterious meetings like this, but she had no choice. And then she saw him, a man leaning against a container, tall, his dark leather jacket blending into the shadows, but his sharp eyes gleamed as the light from the dock flashed across his face. Sarah clenched her fists, taking a step forward, keeping a safe distance. Who are you? Her voice was firm, but she couldn't hide the rapid beat of her heart. The man stepped out of the shadows, his voice low, commanding. My name is Michael Reed. I'm a Navy SEAL. Sarah froze. A Navy SEAL? Why would a Navy SEAL care about Grayson? Michael studied her for a moment before speaking again. I don't work for Grayson, but I've been tracking him for a long time. I have information that could help you bring him down. Sarah ground her teeth. Why should I trust you? What does a Navy SEAL have to do with a real estate fraudster? Michael smirked slightly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Grayson isn't just a real estate fraudster, Sarah. He's laundering money for an international criminal organization. I've been investigating him for months, and I need a witness, someone from the outside who can help bring this case into the light. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. What she had uncovered about Grayson before had been bad enough, but if he was really involved in a global criminal network? She studied Michael's face, her gaze piercing. What do you want me to do? He crossed his arms, his voice steady. I want you to continue with the lawsuit. But this time, you won't just sue him for stealing homes. You'll sue him for money laundering, for being part of an organized criminal network. Sarah clenched her fists. This was no longer just her personal fight. She had entered a much larger, much more dangerous battle. She looked Michael in the eye and nodded. I'll do whatever it takes to bring him down. Michael nodded slowly, as if measuring her resolve. Then we start right now. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the shift in the air. This time, Grayson wouldn't have a way out. On the morning of March 17, 2025, the Bayview District Court was buzzing with anticipation. The golden rays of the rising sun filtered through the tall windows, casting sharp streaks of light across the polished marble floor. The atmosphere was electric, with news reporters elbowing their way to the front, microphones ready, cameras flashing at every possible moment. The lawsuit against Victor Grayson had transcended a mere property dispute. It had become an event that captivated the entire city. Whispers of the case had spread like wildfire, and now the court was packed, each person eager to witness the drama unfold. The door to the courtroom swung open, and Victor Grayson entered. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, his silk tie meticulously knotted, exuding an air of effortless elegance. His posture was impeccable, his movements deliberate and controlled. It was as though he were entering a press conference, not a court of law. He swept his gaze around the room, a smug smile curling on his lips as he surveyed the crowd, his confidence unshaken. He looked every bit the powerful businessman he believed himself to be, his every step radiating dominance. He looked like a man who had everything in the palm of his hand. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her desk. Her body trembled, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the searing anger that burned through her veins. Her nails dug into her palms as she fought to keep control, refusing to let him see that his presence could rattle her. She wouldn't let him win, not now, not ever. As the trial commenced, Grayson's lawyer, Michael Holt, stood up. He was an imposing figure, his suit just as pristine as Grayson's, his voice smooth and practiced, as if he had already rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court," he began, his tone calm, almost soothing. "My client, Mr. Victor Grayson, is a respected businessman, a philanthropist who has made significant contributions to our community. The accusations leveled against him are, quite frankly, a misunderstanding of business practices stemming from legal processes that some individuals simply fail to grasp." Sarah's heart raced as she listened to Holt's words. She could feel the bile rising in her throat. A misunderstanding? That's what he was calling it. A misunderstanding for an elaborate scheme that had forced people from their homes, robbed them of their dignity, and left them in the streets with nothing? Grayson had stolen their lives, and now he was standing in court with his smirk intact, playing the role of a victim. How dare he? Sarah's fists clenched tighter. She could feel the weight of the entire courtroom, the eyes of every reporter, every spectator, all of them waiting for her next move. But she couldn't let that intimidate her. She couldn't let them see her doubt. She had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let him manipulate the truth, not anymore. Holt's voice droned on, smooth and confident, as he continued his defense. "My client's actions, while perhaps misinterpreted, were entirely within the bounds of the law. The contract that was signed by Mrs. Emily Carter was valid, and Mr. Grayson had no obligation to intervene once the legal transfer of property was complete. This is a matter of business, not criminal intent." Sarah's blood boiled. Business? This wasn't just business, it was a scam. Holt's words were nothing more than a veil, a carefully crafted story designed to distract from the ugly truth. Grayson had coerced and manipulated people into signing away their homes, into selling their properties under duress, and now he was trying to spin it as a business transaction. The audacity. The room was thick with tension. Sarah's gaze locked onto Victor Grayson, who was sitting smugly at the defendant's table. His eyes briefly flickered toward her, and she could feel the weight of his arrogance. He wasn't even looking at her like she was a threat. He thought he had already won. But Sarah knew better. She wasn't here to let him off the hook. She was here to make him pay. When it was finally her turn to speak, Sarah stood up. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye now on her. Her legs felt like lead, but she pushed forward. She wasn't going to falter. She couldn't. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart as she stepped up to the witness stand. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she could finally expose the truth about Victor Grayson to the jury and the entire courtroom. She placed a thick stack of documents on the table, her eyes fixed firmly on the judge, her voice steady but laced with determination. "Your Honor, here is a list of shell companies directly linked to Victor Grayson. These companies do not operate in any legitimate capacity, yet they engage in real estate transactions to legitimize the seizure of homes from dozens of individuals, including my Aunt Emily Carter." Sarah flipped to a page and projected a diagram of the connections between the companies onto the courtroom screen. The company Redwood Realty handled the initial transaction, but the property was immediately transferred to Titan Holdings, a company with no actual headquarters. From there, it continued to be sold through various other shell companies, leaving the victims with no opportunity to contest before their properties completely vanished. The jury began to murmur, some leaning in to discuss amongst themselves. They were starting to grasp the sophistication of the scam. Sarah pressed on, her voice growing more intense. All of these companies share one thing in common. They are all founded and managed by individuals directly linked to Victor Grayson. He created an entire system to launder money and steal homes from vulnerable elderly people who couldn't defend themselves. On the defendant's side, Michael Holt, Grayson's lawyer, quickly stood up, his voice smooth and practiced, as if he had prepared for this moment. "Your Honor, Everything Miss Johnson is presenting is pure speculation. There is no concrete evidence to suggest that Mr. Grayson is directly involved in these transactions. These companies could be operating independently, and all the sales were carried out in full accordance with the legal procedures. Sarah felt the fury ignite within her like a raging fire. She slammed her hand on the table, causing the entire courtroom to flinch. You think the suffering of others is some kind of joke? Do you really believe that an elderly woman in her 80s would willingly sign away her entire life savings without any explanation, without any understanding of what was happening? The air in the courtroom grew thick with tension. A few jurors could clearly see the raw emotion in Sarah's eyes, and they understood now that this wasn't just a typical civil lawsuit. This was a fight for justice. But would it be enough to bring Grayson down? Sarah knew she needed a more powerful strike to make sure the jury couldn't doubt the truth any longer, and she was ready for it. Taking a moment to steady herself, Sarah reached into her folder and pulled out the final piece of evidence. This, she said, holding up a document, is a transaction record from one of these shell companies. It shows a direct payment to an offshore account linked to Victor Grayson's personal holdings. This is not just a mistake or a misunderstanding. This is deliberate fraud, a complex web of deceit orchestrated by Mr. Grayson to line his pockets while destroying the lives of innocent people. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Sarah's words hanging in the air. She could see the doubt beginning to fade from the jury's eyes, replaced by something stronger, conviction. Sarah took a step forward, her voice unwavering. These are not just numbers on a page. These are the homes, the lives of people who trusted the system, who believed in the law. And Victor Grayson took that trust and crushed it. She could feel the eyes of the room on her now, and she knew that this was her moment, the moment when she would expose him for what he truly was, a man who believed he was untouchable, but not anymore. Sarah turned to face the jury directly, her voice cutting through the silence. I stand here not just for my aunt, but for every single person whose life has been destroyed by this man. And I promise you, I will not stop until the truth is revealed and Victor Grayson is held accountable for his actions. The tension in the room reached its peak. Sarah knew this was the turning point. She had just set the stage for Grayson's downfall, and she wasn't done yet. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become suffocating. Sarah felt as if she were fighting this battle alone, despite the undeniable evidence she had just presented. But Victor Grayson remained there, calm and composed, as though everything was just a game to him. The jury was still deliberating, but it seemed that Michael Holt, Grayson's lawyer, had succeeded in planting seeds of doubt. He knew how to turn clear evidence into unverified assumptions. Sarah could see the hesitation in the eyes of several jurors. If they didn't believe her, then everything she had worked for would have been in vain. And then, the courtroom door swung open. A loud thud echoed, making everyone in the room turn their heads. Michael Reed entered, his SEAL uniform making him stand out like a steel wall among the crowd. The badges on his chest reflected the chandelier lights, his steps decisive, without hesitation. The entire room went silent. Sarah held her breath. Why is he showing up now? She felt a surge of anger boiling in her chest. This man should have been exposed earlier. Everything should have been wrapped up today, right here in this trial. Michael walked confidently toward the witness stand, his hard gaze sweeping across the room. Victor Grayson, for the first time since the trial began, appeared unsettled. He sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing, his hands instinctively gripping the edge of the table. The judge raised an eyebrow, his voice steady but clear. Who is this? What's your connection to this case? Michael stopped, straightened his back, and his voice rang with authority. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Michael Reed from SEAL Team 7, United States Navy. He glanced at Sarah, then turned his focus directly toward the judge. And I have testimony that could completely change the course of this case. The room seemed to hold its breath. The reporters rushed to take pictures, and the jury members sat up straighter, awaiting what he was about to say. Sarah bit her lip, her heart pounding. This was the moment that would change everything. But what she didn't know was that Michael Reed was about to reveal a secret that would bring Victor Grayson's empire crashing down. Michael's presence in the courtroom was commanding. He was not just a soldier. He was someone with authority, someone who had been watching from the shadows, and now he was stepping into the light. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment. She had fought tooth and nail to get this far, But this was the moment she had been waiting for, the final blow to expose everything about Victor Grayson. Grayson sat there, his composure slipping, trying to maintain control of the room, but it was clear his empire was starting to unravel piece by piece. Michael Reed stepped forward, his voice steady, his eyes locked on the judge. What I'm about to share with this court is information I've gathered during months of investigating Victor Grayson's dealings. Grayson is not just a real estate mogul. He is deeply involved in an international money laundering ring. He has used shell companies and fraudulent transactions to cover up his illicit activities, including the theft of properties from elderly citizens. Gasps filled the room. The jury sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. Michael continued, unwavering. The operation I have uncovered is massive, and it goes far beyond what anyone in this room could have imagined. Mr. Grayson is not just a fraudster. He's connected to organized crime, laundering money through offshore accounts, and using these so-called business ventures as a front to launder illicit funds. Sarah could feel her breath catch in her chest. This was it. This was the truth she had been fighting for. Victor Grayson wasn't just a man who took people's homes. He was a criminal mastermind involved in something far darker, far more dangerous. The room buzzed with shock. Even the judge seemed taken aback by the gravity of Michael's words. Grayson, for the first time, looked genuinely rattled. His face had turned pale, his grip tightening around the table. Sarah took a step forward, her heart racing. She had given everything to bring this man down, and now, with one single revelation, the entire case had changed. Victor Grayson no longer seemed untouchable. The weight of Michael Reed's testimony had struck like a thunderbolt, shattering the illusion Grayson had built around himself. Sarah could feel the shift in the room. This was no longer just her fight for her aunt's justice. It was a battle to bring down a criminal empire. As the judge called for a short recess, the murmurs grew louder in the room. Sarah knew that Grayson's days were numbered, and she was ready to make sure that he would never be able to escape justice again. This was only the beginning. The atmosphere in the courtroom was so thick with tension that it felt as if you could almost hear every breath drawn by those around her. Michael Reed stood at the witness stand, his cold eyes sweeping across the room. The insignia on his chest gleamed, and his presence seemed to command the entire space, radiating power and authority. He took a deep breath before speaking in a low, deliberate tone, each word cutting through the silence like a knife aimed directly at Victor Grayson. Victor Grayson is not just a real estate fraudster. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. He is part of a network that funds arms smuggling and international terrorism, using the dirty money from illegal real estate deals to cover up dangerous operations. The room froze. A few members of the jury stared wide-eyed, while others whispered to each other in disbelief. The reporters sprang into action, their cameras flashing nonstop. Sarah felt as though the world was spinning around her. She was stunned, her heart pounding in her chest, not because she didn't know Grayson was shady, not because she hadn't suspected him of being involved in questionable transactions, but because she never imagined he could be connected to something this monstrous. The anger within her erupted like a raging fire. She shot to her feet, her hands trembling with fury. He didn't just steal my aunt's home. He's selling the lives of others. Sarah felt a wave of rage wash over her. This bastard, who had stripped innocent people of everything they owned, wasn't just a fraudster. He was fueling war, supporting murderers with dirty money. The jury began to murmur, several of them visibly shocked. Some turned to look at Grayson with expressions of disgust. But the most telling reaction came from Grayson himself. He no longer wore his smug smile. His face had drained of color. His eyes darted around the room, struggling to maintain his composure. But Sarah could see a flicker of fear in his eyes. Michael didn't stop. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a stack of classified documents and holding them up in front of the jury. I have direct evidence of financial transactions between Grayson's shell companies and international arms smuggling organizations. I have recordings of conversations between him and foreign partners. And I have transaction data proving that the money from his real estate deals flowed into the hands of terrorists. The room held its breath. Sarah locked eyes with Victor Grayson. For the first time, she saw him not as the man controlling the game, but as a man losing his grip. He was unraveling, his mask slipping away, and she knew this was the moment to finish him off. With every piece of evidence Michael presented, Grayson's empire of lies crumbled. The cold, calculating businessman who had once felt untouchable was now a man exposed, his darkest secrets laid bare for the world to see. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was the end of Grayson's reign, and she was ready to see him pay. Victor Grayson's face turned pale, his hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Gone was the confident, relaxed man who had walked into the courtroom. Now, he was losing control. Sarah could see the panic in his eyes as he stared at the stack of documents that Michael Reed had just presented to the jury. But instead of quietly accepting the truth, he suddenly sprang to his feet, his voice hoarse with a mix of anger and desperation. Lies. This is all fabricated. He slammed his hand down on the table, causing the pile of documents in front of his lawyer to shake violently. I'm being slandered. This is a conspiracy to bring me down. His voice rang through the courtroom, but it no longer carried the self-assurance it once had. Now, it was laced with fear, buried beneath a facade of rage. Sarah felt the fury boiling in her chest as she watched him react like a cornered animal. He had destroyed so many families, stolen homes, and turned the elderly into the homeless. And now, when the truth was exposed, he still had the audacity to deny it. She gritted her teeth, her fists clenched tight, her eyes burning with unshakable determination. He still dares to deny it, she muttered under her breath, her voice thick with rage. I will make sure he has nowhere to run. The judge's gavel hit the desk with a sharp crack, his voice stern. Order. Mr. Grayson, if you continue to disrupt the proceedings, I will have no choice but to implement contempt of court measures. But Grayson refused to sit down. He turned to Michael Reed, his eyes blazing with fury, his voice ragged with frustration. What does a SEAL know about finance? You're just trying to make up stories to destroy me. Michael stood firm, his gaze as cold and sharp as steel. I'm not making anything up. I have the evidence, and I will let the jury decide whether you are guilty or not. The entire courtroom held its breath. Sarah could feel the shift in the trial. Victor was no longer the one in control. He was losing his footing, and she would make sure he didn't regain it. He would face the truth, whether he liked it or not. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the panic begin to surface in Victor's demeanor. He was slipping. His empire, built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling. This was the turning point. Sarah knew that there was no turning back now. She had the truth on her side, and Victor Grayson would have to answer for every crime he had committed. With the room's focus entirely on him, Sarah could see that the walls were closing in around Grayson. His once imposing presence was fading, replaced by the realization that his past actions were now coming to light, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. Michael Reed kept his gaze cold and unwavering as he slowly placed a small USB drive onto the table in front of the judge. The courtroom fell silent for a moment as he activated the large screen before him, revealing a bank statement with enormous sums of money being transferred through numerous offshore accounts. This is dirty money being laundered through Victor Grayson's shell companies. These transactions are not ordinary real estate deals. They are tools used to legitimize money from international arms trafficking. His voice was calm but sharp, each word like a hammer blow shattering Grayson's facade. Victor fidgeted in his seat, beads of sweat beginning to form on his forehead. He glanced at his lawyer, but even Holt appeared more tense than before. As Michael continued, he pressed play on a recording, and the voice that emanated from the speakers echoed through the courtroom. How many guns does he want? A heavy male voice asked. Then, another voice, clearly Victor Grayson's, responded coldly and without hesitation. Send the next shipment. I'll handle the rest. The courtroom erupted. Whispers, sharp intakes of breath, and the flash of cameras as reporters captured the most pivotal moment of the trial. Some jurors gasped in shock, others exchanged tense glances, and many more wore disgust on their faces. They were no longer just judging a fraud case. They were facing someone complicit in global crime. The judge banged her gavel loudly. Order! Her voice rang out, trying to regain control. But Sarah heard nothing except the blood boiling in her veins. Her hands clenched tightly, her entire body trembling, but not from fear, from rage. How many families had lost their homes? How many lives had been destroyed? And now she knew he wasn't just greedy. He was a monster, She locked eyes with Victor, her gaze full of fury. How many people have you ruined just to line your own pockets? Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but Victor heard it. And for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. The courtroom was so silent it felt as though the very air had been sucked out of the room. Every single person held their breath, waiting for the verdict. The jury, after an unexpectedly short deliberation of less than 3 hours, returned to the courtroom, a time that seemed almost impossible for such a complex case. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman, stood up, holding a piece of paper in her hand, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. We have reached a decision. On all charges, we find the defendant guilty. The room exploded. The tension that had been building for months, all the pain, all the suffering came rushing to the surface. The murmur of voices, the flashing of cameras, the click of pens, it was all drowned out by the deafening roar of chaos. A few people in the gallery clapped softly, unable to hold back their emotions, while the victims in attendance couldn't contain their tears of relief. For them, this moment was not just about the trial. It was the end of years of pain, fear, and hopelessness. But even amid the uproar, Victor Grayson shot to his feet, his fists slamming onto the table, his face turning bright red with rage. You'll all regret this. Every last one of you. I have money. I have power. I'll never lose. His words were like a beast's final roar, wild and desperate. His eyes were bloodshot, his body trembling with fury. He still believed he could turn it all around. The sight of him, once so untouchable, now losing control in the face of his downfall, was almost too much to bear. Sarah, who had been silent up until now, couldn't stay still any longer. Her anger flared like wildfire. She leapt to her feet, her voice cutting through his scream. No, it's you who will regret ever touching my family. Her words rang out louder than any of his insults, carrying an undeniable weight. Every inch of her was trembling, but not from fear, from the fury that had been building inside her for so long. She could feel it, the sweat on her palms, the heat in her chest, the rush of adrenaline. But this time, she wasn't powerless. This time, she had won. The police were on him in an instant. 2 officers rushed in, one gripping his arm and twisting it behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs rang out like a death knell. Victor struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was futile. His once cold arrogance now dissolved into panic as he realized there was no escape. Don't touch me. You don't have the right. You can't do this, he screamed, but his voice was weak, hoarse, barely audible over the sound of the crowd's growing excitement. The once mighty Victor Grayson, the man who had controlled so much with money and power, was now nothing more than a desperate criminal, and that desperation was clear in every one of his frenzied, futile movements. Sarah stood motionless, watching as they dragged Victor away, her fist clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. The fire of anger that burned inside her still hadn't cooled. She wanted more than just this. A verdict, a pair of handcuffs. It was nowhere near enough for all the pain he had caused, for all the lives he had ruined, for the families that would never be whole again, for the futures he had shattered. There had to be more. Justice could never be restored in a courtroom alone. Victor was escorted down the hallway, his body flanked by 2 officers, as the flashes of cameras blazed like lightning. Reporters swarmed, their microphones stretching forward, desperate to capture the image of a once feared kingpin now brought low, a criminal being led away in cuffs. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on him, not out of pity, but out of resolve. Her gaze was no longer filled with fear, only determination. She had done it. They had done it. But she knew this wasn't the end. This battle was just the first step. The war was far from over. The hours after the trial felt like an eternity. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on Sarah, and she found herself alone, stepping out into the crisp air outside the courthouse. The cold wind seemed to carry away the noise and tension, but it didn't quiet the storm inside her. She could feel the anger still bubbling beneath the surface. She had won, but at what cost? How many had suffered while the truth had been buried? How many lives had been torn apart while she and Michael played a waiting game with Grayson? A sound behind her broke through her thoughts, footsteps, heavy and deliberate. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. When she did, she saw Michael Reed, still in his military uniform, standing just a few feet away. His expression was calm, almost unreadable as always. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something deeper. "You won," he said, his voice steady, though tinged with an unspoken weight. Sarah's chest tightened, and the anger that had been simmering finally boiled over. She couldn't hold it in any longer. She turned sharply, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "You knew the truth from the start." Her voice trembled with frustration. "So why didn't you act sooner? How many people had to suffer while you stood by and watched?" Michael didn't flinch. His eyes stayed fixed on her, unreadable but never leaving her face. He was calm, too calm. "I couldn't act without sufficient evidence," he said slowly, his tone measured but resolute. "If I'd made a move too soon, Grayson would have had enough time to destroy the evidence. You know how skilled he is at covering his tracks." Her body shook with fury. She understood why he'd waited, but that didn't make it any easier to accept the lives destroyed, the families ruined. And for what? A few more months of waiting? What was the point of holding back when it had cost so much? "You speak as though all that waiting, all that suffering, was worth it," she said, her voice cold, bitter. "But for the families who lost everything, who lost their homes, their dignity, your patience doesn't mean a damn thing." Michael held her gaze for a long moment. He said nothing at first, just watched her as though searching for something within her words. Then, finally, he nodded. "You're right," he said softly, his voice growing even more somber. "But sometimes, to bring down a monster, we have to wait for the right moment." Sarah couldn't accept it, not entirely, but she couldn't deny the truth either. They had succeeded. They had brought him down. But at what cost? Was it worth it? She didn't know. What she did know was this: she couldn't stop now. Grayson was just one of many, and as long as the world still turned a blind eye to injustice, Sarah would be there. This fight wasn't over. The car came to a stop in front of the old wooden house, the place where Aunt Emily had lived for the past 60 years. Sarah helped her out, feeling the sharp bite of the cold evening air seep into her skin. The house looked the same, but there was something that felt different. No longer the warm laughter of old memories, but only the scars left by greed and the cruelty of a man like Victor Grayson. Aunt Emily tightened her grip on Sarah's arm. Her eyes filled with emotion as she gazed up at the porch. "We're back," she whispered, a fragile smile tugging at her lips. Sarah should have felt relief, but all she could feel was smoldering anger. Everything seemed like it had been fixed, yet no one could return the health, peace, and the years of happiness that had been stolen away. She looked at the faded porch, the wooden door bearing the marks of time, and turned to Aunt Emily. "He stole your health. He made you suffer more than you ever should have," she said, her voice tight. "This victory isn't enough." Aunt Emily placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, her eyes warm as always. "You've done what few would ever dare. Don't let hatred imprison you." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of injustice still lurking deep down. She knew this justice was only half of what was needed. There were so many others who would never see the light of truth. A few days later, other families, victims who had once fallen into Grayson's trap, began to seek Sarah out. They came not only to thank her, but to share the pain they had endured. One elderly woman spoke of losing the home her grandfather had built with his own hands, brick by brick. A middle-aged man told of how Grayson had pushed his family into debt, stripping them of everything they had. A young mother, holding her baby in her arms, broke down in tears as she recalled being forced to leave her apartment on a cold, rainy night. Sarah stood in the midst of them, listening to every story, every sob. Each word felt like a knife digging deeper into her chest, igniting a fury within her like never before. When the crowd started to thin out, she walked to a nearby brick wall, clenched her fist tightly, and punched the hard surface, the pain shooting through her knuckles. "Why has the world let people like him exist for so long?" she growled, her eyes bloodshot with rage. The bruises slowly appeared on her hand, but the fury inside her was far from gone. He had been punished, but how many others were still free? How many more were still trapped in the same deceit, just like her aunt had been? She couldn't accept the reality that justice only came for the lucky few. That night, Sarah stood alone on the porch, the streetlight casting her shadow onto the old wooden wall. The wind blew through, bringing the cold with it, but inside her, a different fire burned, no longer just raw anger, but an unshakable resolve. She looked at the house in front of her, the place that had once been a battleground, the place where she had lost so much but also reclaimed what was hers. But that wasn't enough. She knew that if she stopped here, if she treated this as a personal battle that had come to an end, then the others would never have the chance to claim the justice she had. She couldn't let people like Grayson continue to steal the future of innocent lives. She couldn't turn her back on the victims whose pain she had heard firsthand. She took a deep breath, her gaze hard as steel. "I won't stop," she whispered, each word heavy like a vow carved into her soul. "As long as there's injustice, I'll keep fighting." This time, anger was no longer a burden. It had become her driving force, and she wouldn't let it die out. The final verdict had been handed down. Victor Grayson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. All of his assets were seized, his shell companies shut down, and his ill-gotten gains frozen. The media across Bayview erupted with coverage, plastering images of Victor being escorted away in prison garb on the front pages of every newspaper. An empire that had once been unshakable now lay in ruins, reduced to nothing but ashes. But Sarah didn't feel relieved. She stood in front of the television in the living room, staring at the image of Victor being led away, her eyes vacant. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated, but there was no joy to be found. He was still alive, still breathing, even if confined for life behind bars. But what about his victims? How many people had lost their homes, their hope, even their lives because of his greed? She clenched her fist, her nails digging deep into her palm, but the anger remained. "He survives in prison, and yet how many have lost everything?" she muttered, her eyes darkening. Justice had come, but was it truly fair? That afternoon, as Sarah sat on the steps of Aunt Emily's old house, Michael Reed appeared. He still carried the calm, composed demeanor he was known for, but this time, his gaze seemed heavier than before, no longer the cold SEAL officer, no longer the mysterious man who stood in the shadows. He was here not for duty, but for an explanation. "I was bound by duty," Michael said, his voice steady but sincere. "I'm sorry I couldn't act sooner. But if I had acted at the wrong time, all the evidence could have been erased. We might have lost the only chance to bring him to justice." Sarah looked at him, the anger inside her softening just a little, but not entirely fading. She understood what he was saying, but it didn't change the fact that so many people had suffered for far too long. She crossed her arms, her tone cold. "Next time, don't let the innocent wait." Michael nodded slowly, as if he understood that forgiveness wasn't something that could come easily. He didn't try to justify himself any further, simply standing there, letting her decide if there was anything left between them beyond the past. That night, Sarah stood in front of Aunt Emily's old house, alone with her thoughts. The cold wind blew through, making the trees sway, but she didn't shiver. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the waves of emotion still swirling in her chest. She opened her eyes and looked down the dimly lit street ahead, where justice still had much left to accomplish. She had defeated Victor, but he was only a small part of a much larger picture. How many like him were still free out there? How many other victims were still waiting for someone to stand up for them? She whispered, as though reminding herself, "Victor, you're a lesson. But I'm still angry. Angry because there are too many like you in this world." The fire within her didn't die. It was no longer a flame born of mere hatred or anger. It had become a flame of justice, a power that would carry her further, fighting for those who couldn't protect themselves. And it would burn forever. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. This story was more than just a tale of justice. It was a reflection of the battles so many people fight every day, battles against corruption, greed, and injustice. Sarah's fight wasn't just her own. It was for those who never got the chance to speak up, for those whose voices were silenced by power and fear. If this story moved you, if it ignited even a small spark of anger or determination within you, then I ask you to stay with me. There are still countless stories to tell, voices to amplify, and injustices to expose. Subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and be a part of this journey. Every click, every share, every comment helps keep these stories alive and ensures they reach those who need to hear them the most. Together, we can shine a light on the darkness. Together, we can keep the fire of justice burning. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next story.